Hi, my name's Henry Stanier and I work for the Wildlife Trust. I'm the Monitoring and Research Officer at the Great Fen, but tonight I'm at Cambourne, just west of Cambridge, on the edge of Oakswood, part of Cambourne Nature Reserve, and I'm listening for bats. Now, bats are an amazing part of our local wildlife, very elusive, we know so little about them, but there's several species that occur at this wood, from the small pipistrelle bats to the large nocturnal bat. And tonight they'll be on the wing. They're the only true flying mammal, and of course they use echolocation to find their way. Now, although bats come out at night, they've got perfectly good eyesight, and of course they've got very good hearing, and they'll be shouting as loud as they can at frequencies beyond the range of human hearing. And that's why I need my trusty bat detector so I can actually hear them, because this is a piece of equipment that converts their high frequency calls into noises that I can hear, which is great for me so I can learn a bit more about our local wildlife. Now, bats are mammals, and so in some cases they can live quite a while. They can live up to 30 years, and at this time of year, in the middle of summer, they'll have had their young. They often produce one pup, sometimes two, but they need to be out and about hunting themselves to provide food for their young, and so that's what I'm hoping to detect. Some bats often use regular flight routes to feed, and that's what I'm counting on. I'm waiting here on one of the paths through Oakswood in the hope that one of the bats will come and fly past me. So I've got my bat detector ready. Just turn the volume up, and what I'll do is I'll change the frequency to about 45 kilohertz. Now that's the frequency at which the common pipistrelle bat shouts the loudest. That's its peak frequency, which makes it much easier to distinguish it as a species. So if I'm listening for common pipistrelles, tuning to about 45 kilohertz allows me to check to see if there's any in the area. The bats often produce calls at a range of frequencies, but some species do have this peak frequency that I'm listening for. There's another species of bat in the area, the soprano pipistrelle, and not surprisingly, as the name suggests, it calls at a higher frequency to the common pipistrelle, about 55 kilohertz. So if we get one of those, I'll need to tune the bat detector to a slightly higher frequency to pick it up. And there we go. Now that little noise, that is a pipistrelle bat. The reason I know that is that if I look at my bat detector, you can see it's got a little readout there, and it's saying 46 kilohertz. And so that means that anything emitting a frequency at that reading, the bat detector will pick up and then convert into a sound that I can hear. And those popping and slapping noises are a pipistrelle bat sending out its calls, echolocating to detect its prey. So I'm here in the evening, and there we go. I can hear a bat again. That's a pipistrelle. So the bat detector is fairly simple. It's got an on-off switch, which is also the volume control, so I can turn it down and turn it back up again. And I can change the frequency as well. So if I turn it down to say 20 kilohertz, then anything producing a call at 20 kilohertz, it will emit for me. And if I turn it higher to say about 45 kilohertz, I will also hear anything that's emitting a sound at 45 kilohertz. So it doesn't have to be a bat. It could be anything at all. It could be an insect, and it's possible that on warm summer evenings you may get other species as well. Grasshoppers, crickets in particular, that are calling at night, and I expect to get those as well. So I'm just going to walk along a little way and see if I can hear any more bats. Quite a few bats like to follow a regular route as they fly through the night, hunting for food, and so you can soon pick up on these regular routes, these little foraging routes, and pick up bats coming back and forth. Quite a few species will use the same route, and they will use it every night, but bats are quite opportunistic. They will take advantage of food when it comes available. So for example, you might get a night when you get the ants, the flying ants, taking off, and all the bats will be in there picking them off as they fly into the air. But on other nights, they'll be out eating a lot of the midges and mosquitoes that perhaps you're not so happy about. They'll be intercepting you, and they can eat hundreds in a night. So they're our friends for many reasons. Well, that's something I didn't expect. A common toad. Little fellow out here on the path. Obviously it's nice dry and warm conditions, and he's out hunting for insects as well. He's not bothered by the dry conditions, much more tolerant of the dry than frogs are. He's quite a small little fellow, but he's obviously out and about and enjoying the weather as well. Also, as you can see, he's not particularly big, but he's making for the grass, so he should be just fine. I'm just listening to see if there's anything else coming out at the moment. And there you go. That's a pipistrelle bat again, a common pipistrelle. You can see me changing the frequency here, and that's what you do when you use a bat detector. You pick up a bat over the detector, and then you change the frequency to see whether you can still pick it up, because what you're trying to find is the frequency at which the sound of the bat is loudest. That's their peak frequency. And in a lot of species of bat, there's a figure that we have that tells us which species it is. It's quite a warm night, and we've just had a new moon, so in other words it's nice and dark. There's no big bright glowing moon to provide extra light. And bats, they do vary in what they like at night. Some bats will fly up and down along a path where there are street lights, and other bats don't like that at all. And so you will get different species according to the different lighting conditions you get. The pipistrelles, the one that you heard earlier, which was a common pipistrelle, and I heard those because they shout loudest at 45 kilohertz. They don't seem to mind light that much, but other species aren't so keen.
I'm joined now by Henry Stanier from the Wildlife Trust. Hello, Henry.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining us. And we've had a number of questions come in about bats from our audience. So I was wondering if you could help answer some of these for us. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Alexander, age 9, has asked, what are the biggest threats to bats in the UK?
Well, we've had a lot of habitat loss, which is a great shame for the bats. The country was once very forested, lots of trees, and we've lost a lot of those. We are still losing them, and of course with problems like ash dieback affecting our ash trees. Those trees were some of the last big trees left in a lot of our hedgerows, so they're going to go as well. But any development that goes on in the country that doesn't take into account bats, then potentially it's going to affect them as well, because they basically moved out of the trees and then into our buildings because we've cut down all the trees. So they're much more sensitive with what we do with our buildings because they've had to move.
Yeah. So what do bats do during the daytime? Because they're out at night. Where might you find them in the daytime?
Well, they have a little nap. Some of them are quite active still, but obviously they're very busy during the evening. Some of them will be out all evening. Some of them will come out in the early part of the evening when it's warm and there's lots of insects to eat. But as it gets colder overnight, they may go back to a roost and wait till the early morning when it warms up again, but before it gets too light, and they'll start eating on the insects again. But for the daytime, mainly they will rest up, mainly because there's not much point in them being out because there's all the birds out during the daytime eating the insects, so they're in competition with the birds, and there's more predators about. So they might as well do what they've been designed to do, which is just come out at night. That's the best time to feed. There's no competition, and hopefully there's no one chasing them either.
Yeah. So, I mean, that links nicely to one of the questions from our audience as well. The Ks have asked, what time do bats come out? So what kind of time do they emerge in the evenings?
Well, interestingly, you can sometimes see bats at different times of the evening based on which species it is. So nocturnal bats, they can come out before actual sunset. And there was a time when they were much more common, where you could look up in the sky and you'd see things like swifts and swallows hunting insects, and you'd see nocturnal bats as well. So they're some of the first that come out, and then you'll get pipistrelles, which are some of the commonest bats in the country now, and they will come out around sunset. But of course, if you're in a wood where it's darker, they'll come out a bit earlier. And then there's other species like Dorbenton's bat and similar species that prefer it to be nice and dark, and you could be waiting a good hour after sunset before they appear.
How many species of bat are there in the UK?
We have about 18. Bats obviously can fly, and so they can migrate. So we do have species that come into this country, like Nethusius's pipistrelle. So that's a migratory bat. But generally, we're talking about 17 species. There is one that doesn't seem to breed anymore, but the rest of them, they do breed quite regularly. So we're talking about 17.
17. That's more than I was expecting, actually. That's a lot of species.
Yeah, we get some which are very common, and some of them are rare, and you get some that tend to like the south of the country more. And so if you're in the south, you get those species, but not further north. So you compare that to, say, Europe, which has got about 45 species, and then worldwide, you're talking about 1,400.
Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, very diverse.
It's about a fifth of all mammal species.
Yeah.
And they're very good at colonising, so they get to all sorts of places. There's very few places they haven't reached.
Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. So we've had a few questions about the kinds of bats you might be likely to see in Cambridge. So one is from Alexander, age 9, again. Are the bats on the Cam Daubenton's? And are there any other lake bats apart from Daubenton's in Great Britain? And Madeline, age 10, asks, what are the most likely bats I can see in my garden in Cambridge?
Okay, so yes, we do have Daubenton's bats on the Cam. That group of bats tend to have very pale tummies. So sometimes if you have a torch or you manage to see them, you will actually notice that their tummies are reflecting the light. And the Daubenton's bat can actually, they can use their feet to drag along the surface of the water and catch small fish and insects. So they're like little hovercraft flying over the surface of the water. But there is another species of bat called the natterer's bat. It's related, but it's very good at grabbing food from difficult to get places. And so that can also be seen over the surface of the water hunting. But most of the other species will fly a bit higher. They'll be eating insects as they rise off the surface of the water, like mayflies. And they will come down to drink water from the surface and then fly back up again. But normally you'll see them above the water. So there'll be things like pipistrelles, and they'll be the commonest bats in Cambridge, and they'll be the most likely bats that you're going to see in the back garden, either the common pipistrelle or the soprano pipistrelle.
So you were catching pipistrelles on your bat detector in the film that we showed. Can you tell us a little bit more about those echolocation calls? How does it work?
So the bats basically, they've got really good eyesight, but as the light levels drop, they're still hunting these insects. And so the best way to identify where they are and also what size they are is to shout really loudly. So if you're in a big cavern or in a room and you shout, you hear the echo back. And that's the sound waves bouncing off surfaces. And the bats have just basically taken this to the next level, and they shout very, very loudly, but they shout many times a second. So there's this constant stream of sound going out from them. So we can detect what's around us because light is bouncing off objects and coming into our eyes, but the bats do it by using sound bouncing off objects and going into their ears. And the advantage of doing that is they have their source of sound with them all the time. They're shouting. Whereas at night, the sun goes in and we can't see, so we've got to go and get a torch. They don't have that problem, but they can distinguish the direction as to where the insect is going. They can detect what size it is, and so generally find that the bigger bats go after the bigger insects, and the small bats go after the really small insects like the midges and the mosquitoes. So it's a very effective way of navigating, and some birds do something very similar but much more primitive. It's still basically the shouting and then listening for the information to come back again.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's very, very clever, and like you say, being able to see when the sun's gone down is very useful like that. That links quite nicely with another question we've had from our audience, which is, what is a bat's most common prey? So do different species eat different types of insects then?
Yeah, so most predators, if they can get away with eating lots of small things, that's good because there's no risk. You're not going to have anything fight back. And so small bats, if they can go for all the little midges and mosquitoes, that's quite effective. You do have to put more effort in, but a small bat can eat something like, let's say, 3,000 midges in an evening. Yeah. So it's also keeping very, very busy. The bigger bats, they will go for the larger food, and so they'll go for things. Some people know maybugs, cockchafers. They're quite big insects that they fly out in the evenings up into the sky, and so the bats will intercept those. And as I think was already been mentioned by the talk on butterflies and moths, bats will intercept moths in particular. And we've already talked about that little arms race going on between a certain group of moths, the noctuids, and the long-eared bats in particular, because they're constantly adapting to outwit one another, which is a whole fascinating arms race about who can detect the next method of fooling the other group of wildlife so they can either get away from being eaten or sneak past the defences and get something to eat.
Yeah, evolution's an amazing thing, isn't it? It's fantastic. So Evelyn, age 7, has asked us, how long do bats live?
Well, it's interesting. This also affects how sensitive bats are to disturbance. So there are bats, even in this country, that can live as long as 30 years. So for a small mammal, you would normally expect only a couple of years, perhaps a bit longer. But for a 30-year-old animal, that means they're getting very used to their surroundings. So it's a bit like us. As you get older, you get set in your ways, you know your routes, where to get your food from, you know your favourite places to go. So when someone changes it, you don't like it. And this affects bats as well, because if we put new roads in, or we put lighting in places where there wasn't any lighting before, that disturbs the bats. And so living longer means that you can learn your environment and make the most of it, but it also means that you're more sensitive to disturbance when it's changed. So that's the downside of that. But you could say sort of 5 to 10 years might be the average age of an average sized bat, which is quite a long time.
Yeah, I'm surprised how long that is actually. Yeah. And one more question from our audience. Wendy and Knight would like to know, what's your favourite bat? That's always a difficult one, isn't it?
Well, most people tend to go for the long-eared bats because they have a very high cute factor. They've got very big eyes and very big ears that they can fold up and tuck under their armpits, which makes them very entertaining. But one of our local species, which is naturally quite rare, the barbastelle, I've always had a great love for. They're a medium-sized bat, are very black. They live in very small colonies, so a pipistrelle colony could be, say, 400 or 500 females all having their little pups, whereas a population of something like the barbastelles, they may just be a dozen or so individuals in an old tree. But in Cambridgeshire, we have a number of places, the woodlands around Cambourne and that area part of Cambridgeshire, and also even out in the fens in the Great Fen, where it's wooded, there is these barbastelle bats, and you hear them late at night coming out, and they, on the bat detector, they have this very distinctive tock, tock, tock sound, a bit like pebbles being clapped together. They just do it 3 times and they're gone. But they've got quite big ears, but not as big as a long-eared, but they still join at the top. And when you look at them closely, just underneath the chin, it's not black, it's slightly white. So it looks like they've been drinking milk, or it looks like it's shining, which is partly what explains their scientific name, barbastelle, because that means starbeard.
Ah, lovely. Yes. Fantastic. So thank you so much for answering those questions for us, and it's been really great having your film and finding out a bit more about bats. It's absolutely fascinating and such amazing animals. Do you have any?
They are wonderful.
Yeah. Do you have any tips of ways that we might be able to support bats? Anything that we can find out more about bats? Anywhere that we can find out more about bats? Sure.
Well, we run courses on bats. You may see in the future on our website either the Great Fen or the Wildlife Trust BCNP, the website. You might see our wildlife training workshop program, and so you can come along on our wildlife training workshop program and learn about bat calls or about a beginning with bats type course. You can also come out on evenings when we do talks and walks in the future on bats, like we do at Woodwalton Fen in the Great Fen. But in the meantime, you can certainly go out yourself, and a river or a pond, because it provides food and also water, is a great attraction for bats. So that's a good place to listen for them. And similarly, in your own back garden, having a pond, for example, is very good. So a pond for all wildlife is a great addition, but it helps the bats. And then also for moths, for example, obviously quite a few bats eat moths. And so as a result, if you're planting flowers in your back garden, like climbers, like honeysuckles, or night-scented stocks, and other insect-attracting plants, then obviously the bats will take advantage of that, because you're designing them a little fly-through, just to come in, have a snack, and then go off again, hopefully to the next garden that's got some food as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much.